Thank you. Terrific, all three. I really appreciate your contributions to the committee. Let me ask this. What is your assessment how the Basel rounds impact the European response to the current crisis? What is your assessment of what those changes require and how that interacts with what is currently happening? Dr. Johnson?
Senator, I presume you're talking about the Basel Accords on capital requirements for the banks.
Just so you know, the reason I asked the question, we've had a lot of commentary among colleagues asking the question, what are the effects of the increased capital requirements? Are they sufficient? Are they insufficient? What effect are they having on the current challenges?
Thank you, Senator. It's a very good question and highly appropriate to ask it and keep asking it at this moment. Unfortunately, the problem is with Basel is not just the latest agreement, not just this increase in capital requirements, which I think is insufficient. There's a much deeper problem with the way that Basel and this international agreement between major governments, the way they've agreed to think about how much capital you need. They use a concept of risk-weighted assets. And risk-weighted assets means that if you're holding something that's AAA, you don't have to have a lot of equity relative to that position. Well, what's a AAA asset in the European context? Sovereign debt, including Greek debt. And as Mr. Laird laid out for you, people were convinced, and Mr. Bergsten said the same thing, people were convinced, the markets were convinced that Greek and German debt were very, very similar in their credit risk. Well, they're not. They're fundamentally different. And we are looking at a situation where there's real credit risk across a wide range of European sovereign debt. So the entire approach in Basel is deeply flawed. Not only that, Senator Conrad, but the way it's being implemented is very problematic. So the French and the Germans, by all accounts, are backing away from even what they signed up to in Basel. Now, this doesn't necessarily limit what we do. I would argue strongly that we should go further, and the Federal Reserve has, for systemically important financial institutions, indicated that there will be some so-called surcharge. But that's not enough relative to the losses that we potentially face.
Remind us, what are the requirements? What are the capital requirements in the Basel round?
Well, it depends on exactly, it's a very complex arrangement. It depends on exactly what kind of financial institutions you're talking about. And the headline number is between 10 and 12% relative to risk-weighted assets. But I would say the devil is in the risk-weighted assets, in the risk weights. And if the risk weighting is so fundamentally flawed that they've missed completely the sovereign debt crisis and the true risks that all these European banks face and that our banks face because they're exposed to the European banks, and to the extent that any American bank tells you they hedged this risk, they've hedged it through some offsetting derivative contract, such as a credit default swap. The counterparty risk in that swap is probably with a European bank, at least in part. How big is that? How profound is that risk? We don't know. I talk to the senior regulators on this issue. I'm a member of the FDIC's Systemic Resolution Advisory Committee that met for the most recently last week. I don't know the regulators would tell me, even if they knew, but I'm pretty confident they don't know. And that should give us all pause. That's why we shouldn't be, I'm not saying move everyone immediately to 20% capital requirements. You can't do that politically. I understand that. You can suspend dividend payments, absolutely, across the board as an emergency measure, given the European situation. That will be well received. That would bolster financial stability and growth prospects in the United States. It wouldn't be a negative in this environment if it's applied across the board because of the risks posed by Europe and the uncertainty that we all agree still looms.
Dr. Bergsten, what's your assessment of Basel and the capital requirements, sufficient, insufficient? You share Dr. Johnson's view of this?
Yeah, I very much share his view. I do think capital adequacy is at the heart of restoring financial stability here, Europe, everywhere else. And we should err on the side of caution, going to higher rather than lower capital requirements in order to achieve that outcome. There's a fascinating implication from the events of the last 3 or 4 years we should keep in mind. This last crisis, of course, was rooted in financial instability in the United States and Europe. It turns out there was very little spillover to the emerging markets and developing countries. They got some effect from the recession and the weakening of trade flows, but their financial systems stood up much better than ours. Why was that? Well, they had crises in the past. The Asians had crises in the late 90s, the Latin Americans in the 80s, and in response to those, they did, to a large extent, get their acts together. They opted to have financial systems that were not as exotic and high-flying and maybe as innovative as ours. They explicitly and determinedly opted for more risk-averse systems, including much higher capital requirements, and that paid off.
What are their level of capital requirements?
It differs from country to country. Simon, do you know? But the numbers are much higher than ours. They were all put in place after those earlier crises as a lesson from those crises and seem to have paid off very heavily.
Simon, do you know the answer?
20% is not an unusual level of capital in these conservative systems that have previously faced serious crises.
And 20% measured, do they measure on a risk-weighted asset basis
yes,
as well?
Yes, that is a deep methodological problem across all these systems. But they are much more careful, have been much more careful about what they'll count as risk-weighted assets. The Europeans made a huge mistake on sovereign debt. Of course, we made a huge mistake relative to mortgage.
No, we've just had a company go down in part because of bets on sovereign debt. Dr. Larry.
First of all, I echo Simon's comments about the Basel rule. I would raise 2 points. First, there's one true law of economics that was first enunciated by a governor of the Bank of England in the 19th century, and that is every regulation will be circumvented. So when you start setting out very precise rules, you are setting in motion an entire system of people who are certainly are spending their lives thinking how to circumvent them. And remember, regulators are always one crisis behind. They're always thinking about last crisis. They don't know where the next crisis is coming from. And they are paid far less, work far less hard, and are not as highly skilled as the people that are attempting to get around the regulations. So you must keep in mind that when you set out clear regulations, you have a problem. The second is, I saw an old photograph of a bank that had been closed back in the 1920s, but the window front was very interesting. Before the Federal Reserve in the 1920s, 30s, on the front window of every bank, it said capital $10 million or $12 million or $5 million. Now when you look at a bank, it says FDIC insured. That is a fundamental problem. You have a system where very few people pay attention to the capital of banks. Simon raised that the levels are much higher in developing countries, many emerging market countries. Look at Switzerland. Switzerland is the developed country that has the greatest interest in preserving the integrity of its banking system. The Swiss economy lives off its banking system. They propose raising, before anyone else, raising capital centers to 16%, and probably will go higher in order to establish the absolute credibility of their banks in the world. And that's one of the key issues. Banking should be a boring business. It should not be a high-flying business where you take risks, where you trade, where you do all these things. It's a boring business, very similar to a utility. You know, they're supplying payments, they're supplying checking, they're supplying loans to small businesses. This is not an exciting business. It's not a highly profitable business, but it's a fundamental business for the economy. And the job of the government is to make sure that banks are not in danger. And that's why you should make it a boring business.
Thank you very much.